specializes a lot with special ed, impartial hearings. She does pretty much general ed law practice, but for our purposes, today we've asked her to review a couple policies, one that really just to make sure we're in compliance, and she'll go over some procedural things. And one, because we've had a policy for a while, but we haven't been following it, which is problematic. So I've asked her to take a look at these. And similar to what we've talked about before, with trying to thin out the policies from what is nice to have versus what we must have. When we use Erie One BOCES for a service, they'll dump any policy they can onto us. And some of that stuff is irrelevant for our population at hand. So the one that we're going to talk about today, specific to, student gender identity, that's a big one. And most of Ann's time will be spent on that. But the website stuff, per Paul's earlier request, and from what you guys shared with me last year when I was interviewing, there's a lot left to be desired with our website. And so Amanda's been working on making changes and bringing it up to speed while keeping it current. So she's trying to tackle some of those loose ends. And it's quite a task, and I don't think she'll be complete with it all this year, but over the summer, I'm pretty certain she'll clean up what needs to be addressed and get it to a good spot. But we're using Ann because I really want to make sure we're in compliance, so that every time we look at something, we're getting the best advice possible. And then when we roll it out to our administrators, they understand that this is not something you can choose to follow. It's you must follow. So, Ann, does that sound like fairly accurate in terms of how we've engaged in the dialogue?
Yes, it does.
Okay, so if I could just have the board members just quickly introduce yourself and your role, that would be great.
John Bogard, board member.
Hi.
Hi.
Lucinda Collier, I'm board president. Hello.
I'm Paul Stesky, board member.
Good morning.
Morning.
And we are the policy committee.
Well, it's nice to meet you.
So, Ann, if you want to go right ahead, if you could start with the district standards and guidelines for the webpage publishing,
Sure.
that would be great. Because as I said, I think the bulk of our time will be spent on the gender identity one. And then we can talk a little bit about the training that you did for our administrative team.
Sure. So the policy was in really good shape as far as the website one. I made the most minor of changes. I just added, there were a couple of times within the policy where FERPA was referenced, and FERPA, I'm sure you all know, is like the HIPAA to schools. So it's the federal privacy law regarding student education records that applies to public schools. In the sections where FERPA was mentioned, I also added education law 2D. That's our New York State privacy law. So we have an obligation, and we're all still learning 2D. It's complicated, but just generally referencing that in the policy is important because we have to comply with that in addition to the federal law. So I added that in anytime we talked about FERPA. The biggest thing that I did, well, before I go on, any questions so far?
So, Ann, with 2D, it just became a law, correct? I mean,
Yes,
so with the last policy, it's not that the district wasn't compliant, it's more that this now addresses the law.
Right, it's a fairly new law. So the last time this policy was authorized, it was not in existence yet.
Right, and the only other piece that I want to piggyback on for our board members, you'll recall that when I signed last April, one of the first things that I heard walking through district office was the logo that we had been using with the banner was copyright material. So we, again, it's a relatively minor change into the policy, but in practice, we were violating our own board policy. So our logo now that is out is, it is changed and it does not violate fair use or copyright material.
That issue comes up a lot in schools.
Okay,
So the biggest thing that I did with this policy was create a staff sign-off sheet. And it essentially provides that they are familiar with the policy and that they will comply with it. I pulled language directly from the policy into that sign-off form. I have found, so I don't do a lot of labor stuff. I do a lot of investigations, I think because of my background as a psychologist, but I have found that staff violating this type of policy, web page policies, but also any kind of technology policy can frequently be reason for discipline or pursuing a 3020A or other types of separation procedures. So it's important to have these sign-offs that they are familiar with the policy and that they agree that they'll comply with it. I had mentioned to Mike that it's also important that we have something similar for, and I'm not sure what the status is with that, but for the policies regarding the use of district technology and going on the district's internet and things like that. You would probably not be surprised, but staff can engage in some pretty shocking things using district technology and internet. So. And they say they don't know that that's a policy, but if we have them sign off on it each year, they can't say that.
I think we're in pretty good shape with that, with Lisa Brower, making sure that we're up to speed on that. And then when we log on, we actually are signing in electronically. But I do agree with you, following up with her and making sure that we get this in her hands to take a look at, and then also having the union president look at it is probably in our best interest as well, to make sure people recognize that each year this is what we're doing. And Amanda Renko is our PR person. I'll meet with her and Lisa together to just try to ensure that when we go forward with putting all this into practice, that especially as of July 1, that any website changes are compliant, because I know that Tina and Melanie actually found a couple instances where, you know, a different administrator published some things, first and last names of students that they shouldn't have in a newsletter. And we took that down. So thankfully, those two are watching social media for the buildings as well. So are there any questions regarding the sign off or the policy for the district webpage and web publishing standards?
Yeah, I have one. We have a board member who likes to, or was, lifting things off the website and putting them on his own Facebook page. Or sometimes taking pictures or whatever and at an event and then posting them. Is this part of the policy, or is it permissible? Or I just have been concerned that we not give out anything personal on students.
So that wouldn't be part of this policy necessarily. This policy is really about staff using the district's website. So when they create their own teacher website or something like that, that they comply with the requirements for the district, and that they don't put anything on the district's website that isn't approved, or use it for purposes that are not related to education of students. As far as, so let's break that down, because there could be other implications. So the board member is going to district functions and taking photographs and posting that on the board members' Facebook page.
Very similar to what parents do.
Right.
You
And
know,
these
their
are,
child is playing soccer and they take pictures and they post it.
and these are public
There's nothing
events.
bad about them. They-
Right. And these are public events that they're taking the pictures of.
Yes.
So that's probably okay. Let me think about that. Here's the thing. It's a little different from a parent doing it because a board member is in a part of the school district, right? And when we take photographs of students, it becomes an education record under FERPA if it's a close-up picture of that student. So if you take a picture of the entire football field and you can't really pick out who's who, that's not an education record. And that would be fine to post. Once you start getting certain close-ups of students, that could become an education record. Now, we typically have an opt-out that parents have to sign every year if they don't want their child to be part of that. And as long as that child is not part of that opt-out, that should be fine. And that's why you see superintendents post things on their Twitter feeds, up close pictures of students, stuff like that. That's fine. Students engaged in projects, stuff like that. That's totally fine. But we do just have to be mindful of which students have opted out. Usually that's a very small number, if any, each year. And make sure that we don't post a close-up photo of those students on anything sponsored by the district.
Well, we do have a Mennonite population in our school. and
Okay.
They would not like that at all.
That's true. That's true, but they should be signing that opt-out then if they don't like it. There's nothing, obviously we need to respect the cultural and religious practices of others, but there's nothing in FERPA that says if they have a religious reason that they can't have a photograph of their face, that we can't post that, but they can get around that by signing the opt-out. That should be going out every year.
It does. And I know Amanda is very good about making sure that anything that goes on our website is compliant. So that is the benefit of having a single point of access. So Cinda, to your point, if it's grabbed off of our website, it's already gone through that, process, and we do update that annually. That is part of the beginning, the back to school packet. But from time to time, things change, with custody situations or people, change their mind and revoke it. But we try to always keep that up to speed. And I think what Ann is saying about that education record is important for our administrators as well, to remember that they could be, unbeknownst to them, advertising an education record just to make sure they have the proper sign-offs and names as well.
It's good to know. Yeah.
All right.
Another question for you is that the website manager appears to have a great deal of authority and power. Can that be challenged by a faculty member, staff member? And they're using basically their own criteria, aren't they? Which seems a little faulty.
Who's using their own criteria? The website manager?
Yeah.
Yeah, and who is the website manager? I was wondering that as I was going through the policy.
Amanda Renko is our PR person.
Okay.
So this year, it's the first time we've had a dedicated person. So we were contracted out with city BOCES in the past. And, we had a part-time person overseeing it. And there were changes that were made. She tried, Gina up there, tried to keep it up to date, as current as possible. But, with website and social media information, it's constant. But Amanda is a journalist by trade. And, she's up on the Ed Law 2D. She's a BOCES employee that oversees our stuff. And as I said earlier to the group on here, excluding you, Ann, Each week she puts a message out to the building admins to say, hey, I'm working on X, Y, and Z. Anything specific you want me to change, anything you want me to update. But I'm thinking she also goes through the different pages for teachers and checks on that stuff as well.
Yeah, it should be a pretty broad standard that she applies. For the most part, teachers are only posting things that are educationally relevant on their websites. But I once ran into a teacher situation where they were posting on their March Madness pools on the district website, right? That's clearly, there's nothing educational in nature. That's obviously not appropriate. So it should be pretty black and white. Is it related to their instruction and their work as an employee or not? There isn't anything written into the policy about being able to challenge that. The superintendent or the board would always probably have an authority, but don't forget, the district owns this website, so you really do have total control over what goes on there.
Well, my concern was that if Amanda is the manager this year and she retires and I take over, not a board member, but I'm another person, I just take over.
Mm-hmm.
My policy will be different. No, I don't mean the word policies. My
Practices.
standards are different than the last year's, and it could be inconsistent.
That's possible. But again, the standard is it educational in nature? Is it relevant to what the school is doing? Because it doesn't just have to be educational. If they're a coach, for example, and if they wanted to post their practice schedule, that could be something that would be relevant to the running of the district. So,
Okay.
yeah, I definitely think that you guys have an obligation, if you think somebody's abusing that power or not applying it the right way, to make sure that they have the training that they need to know how to do it. But
I think maybe John and I were headed in the same direction on this. So is our website manager, but see, in my mind, who's ultimately responsible? And that to me would be the superintendent or the board. I'm not sure. Honestly, that's one of my questions. So I have two pieces here. Let's answer the first one. If someone were to publish pornography on our website, who's responsible for that? Is that the superintendent, or is that, in other words, who's legally held at risk on this?
it would be, so it wouldn't be the individual, it would be the district, the entity of the district. So it's not like individual board members would have any responsibility, or the superintendent would have an individual responsibility, but it would be the district overall that could be liable for that.
Okay, that answers part of this. So if we can all go to the very last page, in fact, the very last paragraph, where it says oversight.
Mm-hmm.
That's the first time in the whole policy where we mention the superintendent.
Right.
Now, in my mind, the superintendent is ultimately responsible for the website management, for a district website, for a school websites. And so that's kind of what I actually had a little slight alter of what I wanted to put on there was like the superintendent is responsible for the district website administration, and then John going to where you were and has the ultimate authority to approve or disapprove.
I would take exception to that. I mean, because you're going to have me sitting there staring at the website all day long. I mean, I possibly can't commit that kind of time. You know, the way it's worded now, it's me or my designee. Now,
Yeah.
Certainly with the software that we have that flags everything, I mean, I get multiple messages a day when kids get on stuff and look at, you know, inappropriate material with their Chromebooks, and I get alerted to that. And then we have a process set up where, you know, the building administrators will take care of it and then report back to us and let us know what's going on. Same thing with like Amanda, the role that she has, she's our designated person because again, I just don't have time to make sure everything's up to date and current like she would. And that's her area of specialty.
Sure, I
So-
understand that, and I wouldn't want you to be, I wouldn't even beg for you to be involved on it, on a every basis. But that's why I thought ultimate authority, and then with your designee to do the daily work.
Well, that's pretty relevant with all areas of the school, though. I mean, so pretty much you guys oversee me and I oversee everything else. So I think that's pretty much the way it's implied. But I do think the way we have it structured right now, and again, Amanda started, I think, the 1st of November, Tina, right around there, late October, 1st of November, where she was dedicated to us. She's really done a fantastic job with corralling that. And I also want to give Lisa Brower
I think so.
props because she's been on top of it. So last year, when I used to see all these taglines compliant with Ed Law 2D, we actually have a staff development as part of our annual training that says, you know, you've signed off on it. In terms of the web page publication stuff that Ann just provided us with, I think that's a natural segue as well. And ultimately, if Amanda saw something that was inappropriate, she would bring it to my attention, and it might come through Bob or it might come through Megan as our compliance officers first, and then get to me, and then up the chain to you all. So just food for thought as to why the broad stroke there is better than the fine stroke.
Well, that's why I wanted to say ultimate responsibility or ultimate authority, because of course your day-to-day would be the designee. It just seems strange to me that all of a sudden, at the very end of that document, we mentioned the superintendent will have authority to approve, when the whole time we've been saying the website manager will have the authority.
Yeah,
It's
but
not
I
a
don't
big deal to me, okay? I'm not going to war with this, but it just seemed like it could be worded a little better.
I think the word ultimate in there is not appropriate though, because that would mean to me is that it is a step as opposed to in general. I think if you see something or she sees something that you can deny it. Ultimate to me means it has to go to her first, designate first, and then to you. And I don't think I think this is a broad, and the broader it is, I think the more power it is, because you can
That's what I
use
was
it in
thinking.
many.
If you were talking about someone that wanted to challenge it, with whom would they challenge it? And I would think the superintendent would be the ultimate authority. Again,
Well, he or she is in any district for everything, basically.
yes,
Right, we wouldn't want the website manager to have to deal with people challenging it. Hopefully this wouldn't come up too often, but I read this as the website manager being the designee, because the superintendent decides who is doing that. Website manager is a made up term, right? It's not like an official role within a district, but yeah, the superintendent, if there was an issue, that would be the final person to consider and make a final decision.
okay, like I said, I'm not going to war over this. This is fine.
I think regardless, it's worth a conversation with the administrators and with Amanda, specifically with that in mind, so that they're paying close attention to it and ultimately understanding where we're going with respect to making sure we're Ed Law 2D compliant. We're not publishing an education record unbeknownst to the child, the family, or even the district. And I guess making sure that our materials are school and educationally appropriate. But I think that's exactly why, John, we wanted Ann to come as well, because I think with so much of what we're worried about in this day and age is liability. I mean, so to Paul's point, there is so much that we're vulnerable to on a daily basis that I think having the assurance that we've had a professional go through this for us and look to make sure we're stopping things before they become a real problem that's part of why I think this process is invaluable for us. Put a little investment up front to save us in the long run, which in my opinion is a perfect segue to the student gender identity. And this is something that I think we're really behind the times with. I hate to say that, but we're about 5 years overdue where we need to be with respect to training for students that are transitioning and transgender children. And I'm going to ask Ann that you just kind of walk us through that, because our last policy had some of the right terms, but not necessarily the corresponding education component with it.
Right. There's a lot in this policy that's the same, but I just started fresh because there were so many different directions that I thought it was important that we go in. So I didn't revise the old policy. I created a new one with some similarities and some differences. So I'll walk you through that. The previous policy was done about a year after SED put out their guidance for transgender students. So there was nothing wrong with it as of the time it was written, but this is something that's constantly changing. So it's important that we stay on top of those changes. So and you all have it in front of you, right? Oh, okay, so just working through it, the definitions, I updated the definitions so that they're more current for the definitions that we're using now with transgender students. The harassment and bullying is pretty much the same. Transgender students are protected against under the DASA policy, the Dignity for All Students. They're also protected under Title IX. And I referenced the relevant policies there that you have on that. As far as issues of privacy, this is a tricky situation. So with transgender students, we have to take everything on an individual case-by-case basis. There are some transgender students who are totally fine with everybody knowing that they're transgender and that they've transitioned. There are other transgender students where that is very private information for them, and they do not want anybody to know. They only want people to know what their identified gender, name, and pronoun is. With transgender students, the state guidance has told us that we need to follow the student's lead. So with what the student wants to be called, how they want to be identified, who they want to know, we have to follow their lead with that. And so it could look different in every situation. And that's for anything that could come up. And that's throughout this policy. I'll talk about how what the student want may be different in different situations. So if a student doesn't want people to know about their transgender status, if it is a child who was biologically born a male who now identifies as female and only wants everybody in school to know that they're female, the state guidance says that in their records, we're supposed to, from the time that they say I'm female, we're supposed to identify them that way from that point moving forward in their records. And anything from before that should be kept in a private confidential file and not accessible, not in their cumulative folder where any of their teachers can go through and look at it and learn about the student. It's in a private confidential file. So this section, this issues of privacy section, addresses that, and also addresses that there could be situations where we do have an obligation where we have to disclose their transgender status, such as medical situations, stuff like that. But this section has been updated. Now this is usually a big one. So are there any discussion or questions about that?
How would you handle the transfer of a student who has whatever you call
Transitioned. They've transitioned and they've already transitioned, then they transfer into the district?
Well, yeah, that's a good one too, but also from one level to another. In other words, if it happened at the middle school level, they go to the high school level, the one principal knows it, maybe not.
Mm-hmm.
And it's in the best interest of the student, I think, that the high school principal knows it too, or the nurse or somebody, I don't know, that confidential file becomes so confidential, how is it handled?
Do you
That's a
want to
good-
jump in on that, or do you want me to give my opinion first?
Well, why don't you start?
So by nature, everything that you just described would be that once the child's changed their record and they've identified by the gender that they want recognize as, they're transitioning to, everything in school tool, every school record would start to reflect the gender marker, the student's chosen name, everything that would move forward would be that chosen name. So let's say it becomes Bill, for example. Bill's records now will reflect Bill from 5th grade forward, 8th grade forward, 9th grade forward. With respect to the confidentiality, there is a process that we have in place where the records prior to being identified as Bill would be sealed, signed off, and kept under lock and key. And as Ann said, the biggest piece when it comes down to issues of privacy may be in the medical arena.
Yeah.
So if Bill was a female at birth and was transitioning to male, the nurse may also understand that the child hasn't gone through the full transition process, meaning surgery, etc. But again, between FERPA and HIPAA, the medical practice, the practitioner would be bound to confidentiality under those things. So in my experience, most children that start to transition, as Ann said, you have to treat them individually, but most, once they start to transition and realize that they have support, they're more and more comfortable with letting people know what's actually going on with them because they feel accepted and able to, move forward with their identity.
Right. The standard that we want to apply is, does an individual school employee have a legitimate educational interest in knowing this about this particular child? The school nurse probably always does, because there are exceptions made for medical records and things like that. Maybe in most cases, probably the building administrator may have that legitimate educational interest as well. And again, it depends on the situation. And it depends on different factors that are there. So in my experience, the building principal would know. In my experience, typically the school psychologist would know. You don't always have to have classroom teachers know, though. They may not have a legitimate educational interest.
I had a
That makes
question on that though, because when you get to testing, then you have to use the original name. So if I'm a math teacher and the student is taking a standardized test, let's take Bill, for example. Bill's not the name that's on the test, so I'm confused.
So there are certain situations for standardized tests where we have to use their legal name. And if that was a situation where a teacher was administering the test, then they would probably have a legitimate educational interest in knowing. So I'm not saying that teachers never have that legitimate educational interest. I'm just saying it's not an automatic.
Okay. That makes sense to me.
And again, it depends on the student. So some students may just tell everybody themselves, right? And that's totally different than a student who is feeling very uncomfortable with people knowing.
I was taking the worst case scenario as far as transfer of knowledge. In other words, I don't want anybody to know, period. So
here's the thing, okay? So FERPA is an umbrella that goes over the district. So if the middle school principal tells the high school principal, and maybe there really isn't a legitimate educational interest, the most important thing is that the high school principal keeps that information confidential.
Right.
FERPA, the most important thing for FERPA is that we don't let people outside of the district know private student information without consent. And we have to, obviously, within a district, keep it as private as possible, but there's no FERPA police. It's unlikely that there would be some kind of cause of action against the district if one principal disclosed to another. We should try not to do that, but I think that the ramifications and the risk is pretty low for that from a legal perspective.
Okay.
Where you would get into trouble is if it was becoming a gossip, right? And
Yeah.
everybody was kind of chattering about it. And if the student was experiencing some kind of negative effect from that, that would be problematic. Are we ready to move on?
Yeah, please do, yes.
Okay, so school student records in New York State, if a student is transgender and identifies as a different name from the name that is on their birth certificate, there is no requirement in New York that they have a legal name change. New York tells us that we should identify them by their identified name, regardless of if it's a legal name change or not. And the only exceptions to that are things like standardized tests that require the legal name, and when a student needs to use their legal name for medical care. So if the nurse has to call their pediatrician and their legal name needs to be used in that situation. But other than that, we are not required to have them legally change their name. We are supposed to call them by their identified name. And that's from, and again, we can't, so if a student says, I'm transgender, we can't say, well, what's your name now? Okay, that's what we call you. That's not how it works. We have to work with the student and say, you let us know if you want to be called by a different name, and if so, when, and we work through it with that student. It's not the same for every student.
So for the board, the one piece that I would assure you of is there is a pretty much, it's a process that we actually ask the administrators to go through. You know, we talk a lot about how policy guides procedures. So this is something where, unfortunately, because our policy hadn't been changed, we tweaked the procedure administratively to make sure that the administrators had what they needed to do prior to this actually happening. And it'll be compliant with the policy. But because when students come forward and identify, the administrators didn't have a working checklist as the steps they needed to take. So we've kind of worked through a few things, not with Ann on that particular situation, but with Sarah, to make sure our practices were in alignment with where our policy would go. And it's step by step as far as how they're, you know, going through the name changes. And most often cases, it's the student comes forward and identifies to a trusted adult. And then we start the conversation there in terms of getting more supports in place. That trusted adult could be a classroom teacher, it could be the school counselor, school psychologist. In many cases, when I was a building principal, it was me. And then we would sit down with the counselor and the supports and the family, and then go step by step to ensure all the children's, or all the child's needs rather, were met. And that really is specific to the school records as well, you know, because again, in some cases, students don't even want to go home and disclose that this is what they're doing at school. And, you know, it gets to be tricky when you go in and look at yearbooks and, you know, all of a sudden you see Bill is identified by a different name other than Bill. So from one year to the next, parents start looking back and say, well, I never consented to that. And as Ann said, well, it's really what the child wants to be identified by. And then as far as the official school records, you know, taking all these necessary steps into account. And that's going to kind of take us to the names and pronouns.
Right. So when we say their school records, if the student is saying this is the name that I identify as, their transcript, their report cards, all of those things would reflect their identified name. Names and pronouns, we've talked about this, but we do follow the student's lead. This can be tricky in practice, especially when parents are not on board. And that requires a lot of navigation on the part of the district to try to balance the rights of the parents with the rights of the student in that situation. But we are supposed to default to following the student's lead and the student's wishes in these situations. So this, this section addresses that. It's important that people have a lot of personal opinions on this, and I get that. I understand that, but it's important that we also make sure that our own employees are respecting the student's name and pronouns. And that's on the district to be sure that that's happening. People slip up and it happens, but if an employee is consistently calling the student by the name and pronouns that the student does not want to be used, that can become problematic, and that can become a discrimination issue.
I've actually had to address that in the past with a staff member who refused to use the correct pronouns and name, you know, very intentional refusal. So it was, and we have it in there. So, and I appreciate you putting in the intentional and persistent piece, because I did have to address that with a staff member. And their personal opinion and subjectivity got in the way of honoring what the child's legal rights were. This next one, the restroom accessibility, you know, you'll recall that this was something that in December, the governor put out a mandate and gave New York State public schools a very specific time frame to put up markers identifying gender neutral bathrooms and facilities. And that was the, I think it was probably the catalyst for a conversation we recently had.
Right, and I tried to be really careful with how I worded this section. So students are permitted to use the restroom or locker room that corresponds with their consistently expressed gender identity at school. That is something that the state has told us. But I added that consistently expressed because there's always concerns of, oh, well, the boys are just going to go into the girls' locker room and say that they identify as girls. Now, I haven't actually come across that happening, but it's a concern that many people have. So that consistently expressed. And then I also added that any individual, regardless of gender, may request increased privacy or other accommodations, because some people may not feel comfortable in certain situations in the restrooms or the locker rooms. And even though we have to allow students who are transgender to use the restroom that they identify as, if somebody else feels uncomfortable with that, they can get accommodations in that situation. We can't force transgender students to only use the gender neutral restrooms or to only use certain designated restrooms. A lot of districts have tried to address this by, in the locker rooms, for example, putting in private changing areas, and anybody who chooses to can use those private changing areas. But we can't require transgender students to use those when it's not required of other students.
Yeah, I noticed you also changed it from student to any individual. So if you have a staff member, that's good. I still wonder how this works in practice. The policy sounds good. Mike, do you have experience with this?
I have, yeah, go ahead.
A lot, actually. So from my experiences personally, it's gone remarkably well. I would say to you, our administrators currently are doing a fantastic job of accommodating children's requests, and they're working with students and families. But my experience and really comes down to basic human value. And how do you treat people with dignity, period? You know, if we keep that in mind, usually we come out okay on the other side. But as Ann said, I think about the accessibility. There are a lot of people who are not necessarily transgender, but feel uncomfortable in large group gatherings because of body image or, fear of using a restroom in a public place. So you make sure that you're accommodating their own personal needs. We've asked our athletic director and the director of facilities to look at putting in privacy curtains to change in the locker room behind curtains, to make sure our restrooms have the appropriate stalls and dividers up. But I think in terms of, the consistently expressed gender identity, to Ann's point, I never had a child walk into a bathroom that they didn't belong just to say, well, I'm identifying as this today because it's Tuesday, and then Tuesday afternoon, I'm going back. But I think in society's eyes, that's exactly what happened. And I did have to deal with a very particular situation where an outsider was targeting one of my children, to the point where law enforcement got involved. So I
Yeah.
think this is the way it's written is very, very good.
So
Yeah,
in my experience, the students tend to take this in stride. It's typically the adults that have a harder time with this, in my experience, be that staff, parents, community members. But the students really are pretty open-minded about this kind of stuff for the most part.
And hopefully that will change as the students become adults.
Right. Right. I mean, even when I was a student, this was not something that was in my awareness, right? It is.
Right.
It is something that's changing in society as far as people being more aware about it.
People feeling uncomfortable and changing has been there for decades.
Yes.
In my experience, that I always had students who, in middle school level, they would do everything and anything they could not to go to the locker room.
Right.
I was one of those. I understand completely.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not pleasant when you're an adolescent to be in a locker room for the most part. So,
No,
I
Yeah.
like the idea, the curtains up and that kind of thing is a real step forward, and at low cost, and it's very effective. I hope.
Now, Mike, we've already identified the bathrooms, restrooms that are in, what do we call it, individual or?
Gender neutral.
Yeah.
Yep.
In both schools, right?
Yep.
Yeah,
So
okay.
we're working on the final marker to be permanent. What we did was they printed off some stuff that we felt would be appropriate, and we have those up while we wait for the placards to come in to be permanently mounted. And what we're trying to do is identify other areas, because as Ann said, it can't just be one particular facility. They have to have access to the facility based on the gender they identify. But I often try to relate it to people like the ones where you have children as you go to an airport, or you're in a restaurant where it's a family area, because, if you're an adult male taking your female child to the restroom, you don't necessarily want to walk into the men's room, and vice versa with an adult female taking your young male child into that. So we liken the gender neutral to that, and basically say it's a facility for anyone. But it's also something that for children who are looking for a single unit facility, sometimes that's the most comforting thing as well. This next piece, the participation in physical education and interscholastic athletics, has really heightened people's awareness to say, when you group, be mindful of, you can't say boy, girl anymore, or do activities exclusively based on gender assignment per se. And I mean assignment meaning for the role for the particular class, not how they identify by gender. But I think in terms of like phys ed classes, if they were doing a square dance unit, typically you would try to partner male and female students up. Or if you were doing sex specific activities based on particular gender, male or female sex it's something where you go through and now you say, okay, we can no longer just use those two characteristics to define what we're, identifying the activities by. And I don't know if I did a great job explaining that, but in terms of more along the lines of saying, hey, how you group kids or how you group students rather, it's important that you keep in mind there may be students that are uncomfortable being designated male or female, and your activities should not necessarily reflect that.
Right. And then I kept, as far as the sports, I kept that purposefully vague because the New York State Public High School Athletic Association does have current guidelines on what we're supposed to do when a student who is transgender, gender nonconforming wants to participate in the team consistent with their identity. But that, I don't know if you've noted, if you've seen in the news, even recently, there's multiple states that are passing or considering passing legislation on this. This is a sensitive topic. They say that people who are biologically male should not be able to participate on female sports teams just because they're typically bigger and stronger, and that's unfair. I'm not here to give any value judgment to that. It's pretty politically charged. We need to do what New York State tells us to do. So by keeping it fairly vague in this policy, whatever the current guidelines for New York State are, is what we will comply with.
The other activities, that one right there, that's pretty much, it corresponds with what I said with phys ed, the sex segregated situations. So, I've asked our administrators to be cognizant of overnight trips, where, typically you would have, females room with females, males room with males on a trip. And in this particular situation, again, if you have an overnight trip to Washington, D.C., child identifies as female, it's okay for that child to room with other female students. Same thing if they were a student who identified as male, it's okay to identify or place them with other students, other male students on that overnight trip. And a lot of times, as Ann had stated, this is usually resolved by the student and their peer group. In my experience, when we had a group of students go to New York City or go to an overnight trip for a choral concert, accommodations were not an issue because the child and their peers made sure that they were placed appropriately, and the adults that were supervising were great with facilitating that.
Right. I did give the principal the authority to figure this out on a case-by-case basis. Typically, it's not an issue, but if we have a student, just like any student, right? If we have a student who really wants to room with certain students, and if they're not comfortable with that for any reason, that's an individual case-by-case situation that we need to work out. But I put in there with the emphasis on maximizing the student's social integration, because the way the policy was written before made me a little nervous that it seemed like we could require the transgender student. It didn't come out and say this, but the language was such that we could maybe deny a transgender student's request to room with other students of the same gender. So we should, usually this is not an issue for the kids. They usually have their friend group and they want to room together. So, but
A few years ago, we went through a kind of similar situation. John, do you remember with the honors trip to, no, I don't think you were principal then, to New York, and they divided the kids up, but a mother and a father were going to be in a particular room with a bunch of girls. And those parents raised the roof. They didn't want that man in their daughter's room. So it was, I don't, maybe you remember how it got resolved, but it was to the point of almost canceling the trip. I recall it was a real big issue.
I like the word that you consistently use the word consistently asserted school. That's sort of, that to me kind of eases my mind and also covers a lot of issues.
Right, and if you'll see, I even took care to remove the gender specific language within our policy. There was a lot of he, she, and things like that, and I tried to take all of that out so that the policy itself is reflective of current best practices for how we address these issues. And then the last thing is the dress code. We can't require any student we can't have gender specific dress codes. And we've known that for a while now. So we can't say boys can't wear skirts. The dress code, we can have the skirt lengths have to be a certain length, right? But that applies equally to boys, girls, or however they identify. So we can require them to adhere to the dress code, but it cannot be gender specific. And that's regardless of their gender identity.
So it seems to me like if somebody's transgender and they've gone through the surgeries, Mike, as you suggested, that becomes a non-issue. It says, John mentioned that when someone's in transition, I think that's where obviously it becomes kind of sticky.
It really is. I mean, for a variety of reasons. I mean, so much of what we talk about in terms of societal norms and the pressure that these children face as they move forward and, you know, come out and identify, that takes a lot of courage. And a lot of times you'll see, you know, this parallels with our mental health stuff because the enormous amount of pressure that these children are under. And financially, most children that come out and identify in their school age experience don't have the financial wherewithal to go through the actual surgery. And I know that in many cases, they start off with the progression, and then they actually, you know, if they're fortunate enough, have the surgery after they graduate. My experiences anyways have been the majority of the students who came forward with me as a building principal identified, started the transition, and then we're hoping to have surgery after graduating high school. There was only one exception to that in probably, I want to say 15 cases where students identified and in transition. There was only one that was planning a surgery prior to graduation. But a lot of this really speaks to, again, you know, basic human rights and treating people with dignity, regardless of gender, regardless of identity, and educating people on the fact that gender identity is not the same thing as sexuality. And really, for our purposes, and I'm thankful that Ann, you know, took this on, because she said it in 2015, state ed gave guidance. And, you know, not a lot of our administrators were up to speed with respect to the actual professional development side in terms of what we needed to do to be compliant. So Ann conducted a training with our administrators. And I have to say, I think it was in January. I don't recall what month it was. It might have been February, but I want to say early this year that she came in and did the training with us. So like Ann said at the beginning, regardless of what their personal opinions are, this is going to give us a lot of information as to how to meet students' needs in an educational setting. And I think the policy does that. And I think the changes she's made have helped us out substantially.
So
Will there be a sign off sheet in this one too?
On the actual policy for their training or what? What do you mean?
Well, yeah, like the other one we're doing a sign off sheet. so that we are sure that the staff is at least knowledgeable about the web usage.
So
Do we need to have a, go ahead, go ahead.
I haven't really thought that far ahead about whether they need to have a staff sign off. And the reason I'm leaning towards no is because we don't do that for every child.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
to say we do a staff development for all children. But I would say to you, under DASA and making sure that we're compliant with the Dignity for All Students Act, there's a component that they have to identify with. And then as far as the actual book talk and the study, what I hope is that this stuff becomes more and more a part of our practice, no different than if we were working on special ed compliance. And when it comes down to how to educate in any setting, so that we're not looking at students that are transitioning as a particular population, but part of our population, you know, like we would with typical children, exceptional children, children with special needs, that type of thing.
Can I ask
Yeah,
you
I
one more?
agree. I think that training and oversight is more important than a sign off for this kind of stuff.
Another question for you. These two policies are not what we would get from Erie 1 BOCES. Is that correct? These are basically massaged a little bit by you.
So the first policy that I did, I barely changed anything. So I find that the Erie 1 BOCES is a really good starting point. And sometimes we have to make lots of changes and sometimes we don't have to make many. The transgender policy, there are elements in there that are consistent with that Erie 1, but it's more updated than what we had.
Should we not make a notation at the bottom then that it's not word for word, somehow it's not word for word Erie 1 BOCES?
No, I don't think you need to worry about that because
Yeah.
the policies are your policies as the board members. So regardless of where you get them from, it doesn't matter. Once you adopt them, they're yours.
Well,
I
what I'm
agree with
saying,
that, John.
historically, it gives you a little bit of history behind who did it and when, and as opposed to just saying, oh, well, it must have been an Erie 1 BOCES policy, and it really is not totally.
Yeah, I'll leave that up to you guys to decide if you want to identify it that way. In my experience, districts typically modify those Erie 1 BOCES policies pretty frequently, but every district is different.
That's so, Ann, to speak to that point, we would put the adopted date in there.
Right.
It would be as of March 2021. But I think to John and Paul's point, and Cinda can attest to this as well, what had happened was the district went through a policy audit, and we have so many policies that are in need of review. We're trying to tweak things that make sense specifically for North Rose-Wolcott versus, you know, everything that was recommended by Erie 1 BOCES. Because what with that service, as you know, they just dump every policy out there, and whether you take the time or have the ability to go through it or not, they basically overwhelm a system and push it all at you. And then some of it's irrelevant, but you've adopted it as a policy because Erie 1 suggested it. And we're saying, look, some of that stuff is just purely minutia. We need to get away from it. And some of it is so not relative to what we're doing here. We also need to look at it that way. So to the policy committee members, Tina's going to give me the update on where we are audit wise. I think for our purposes, what I would suggest is, we don't need Ann for this, that we kind of let Ann go if she's done, or if you have any other questions for her. But for our group, what we should do is carry on a quick discussion as to what we think are the natural next steps. My finding has been having her and Sarah work with us saves me so much up front. because again, it kind of gives me, it takes it from such a broad perspective and gives me the laser beam focus that we need in order to make sure we're compliant on behalf of our district and we're not vulnerable to something that we haven't necessarily adhered to based on what Erie One's, subscription has offered us. And that's not to say that we're ever vulnerable based on what they provide us with. It's just vulnerable when we take it and adopt it en masse and we haven't looked at it and tailored it to meet our district's needs. Do any of you have questions for Ann?
I don't have a question, Ann, but I still have a little underlying concern. And Mike, how you point out that we must adhere to the and take good care for the individual. I completely understand it. I'm all for it. My little concern is that sometimes I worry that we compromise the masses for an individual. I don't see any, I don't want to change the policy. I don't see anything that I can say other than that. I'm just a little uncomfortable that we do that.
So that to me, I think, and this is something where I think there's power in ambiguity, because I think when we read it and we take it case by case, that's how we should apply it. It's similar to like the vision statement, and you can attest to this because we talked about it last week. Sometimes when you have ambiguity or broad stroke, it benefits us because we want every person to pick up that policy and say, okay, when I read this, I want to make sure Michael Pullen's needs are met. And I want to make sure that I'm doing this. So if Michael Pullen picks it up and he says, listen, when it comes down to, cisgender, people can read this policy and identify that he's okay with the way it's written. So I think that's why it comes in that way. And we want it to be up to the reader, not necessarily just the author. But I agree with it. I understand where your point was, and it's well made. John, did you have anything else for Ann?
No, I think you did a great job with the body, especially of this last one.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah, a lot of
Cinda?
good discussion. That was great. Thank you.
You all set, Cinda?
I am, yeah.
Okay, Paul, you're all set as well?
Yeah, Annie,
Okay.
appreciate it.
And thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. So obviously for our policy committee, we have to figure out, how to get through the policies in an effective fashion, make sure that we're compliant with state ed, make sure that we're compliant with the policies in practice. And again, I think that we've identified a few instances this year where we weren't necessarily following through with the policies the way they were written. In both of these discussions this morning, we've identified two specific things that we weren't necessarily compliant with. One being the fair use and copyright material that we've since amended. And then with the student gender identity, the subsequent training that went along with the policy that was created in 2016. But we've worked to correct both of those. So I just need the group to think about what you feel is the most appropriate way to move forward. We don't need Ann to represent us every time, but I think it's good to have our legal counsel read through our policies and make recommendations to us. And what we could do for purposes of efficiency, we could actually give them chunks so that they read them. And then we get the edited version with the strike throughs. And then when we meet, we can discuss it and go forward that way. And then whatever additions that they add, we'll see those. So strike throughs might be red and then additions might be green.
That's what I was going to ask you about. If we had the changes for the credit union, what we do is we get a summary sheet and then we get the strike throughs and then we discuss that, and it shortens the discussion greatly. My one question, and I've got to ask it, is you alluded to the procedure book. Are the procedures up to date then for these? Don't laugh.
I'm laughing because there is no procedure book. I'm creating it as we go. With
Oh.
respect to transgender stuff, yes, we are up to date because again, I reached out and made sure that what we put in practice, part of our administrative procedure book will correspond with the policies. And we're creating the procedure book to correspond with it. Part of our procedure with respect to student gender identity is based on practice that I've used in the past. And it's based on work that we've actually completed with Sarah through Harris Beach so that they made sure it was compliant. But the policies that are referenced on the webpage are all current or under review. And as I said earlier, Tina's got the list of policies from the last audit that we have to go through. We can cycle through and reduce the discussion, but I do feel like it's best to have somebody do that for us. And you'll recall, we talked about having somebody do that in the fall, but then the cost became prohibitive. And I said, I would not support it to the tune that they were going to charge us. But I think that once we get through the rest of the policies that were identified under the audit, to just kind of keep ourselves current, I can go back and make sure that the administrative procedures are all in alignment with the new policies.
Now, Mike, just to bring us up to date and current with these two, we have to put these on, distribute it to the board for a first read, second, so on, and
Yep.
discussion, and then vote on it. So these two are going to be the next board meeting, I would assume.
Correct. Yes,
Okay. So
that is
Tina,
correct.
You're going to send these around to the board members.
First read.
Tina will put those out and then we'll go through the same steps. That's why the adopted date is still open right now, because it's probably not likely to happen until, the end of April.
Right.
It corresponds with the BOCES vote, because I think that one's a Wednesday meeting for us. And I think we've identified, was that the 28th, Tina?
28, yes.
Yeah,
April
so
28th.
likely they'll get the first read and then the discussion, and if we adopt, it'll either be the 28th or the first meeting in May. The 11th.
I can do the first read at the first meeting in April and the second read the second.
Mhm.
Okay, that sounds good. And as far as going ahead with it, I agree with your plan. I think we really do need to have it expedited with strike through, somebody to read it, strike throughs, the changes, and then it makes it a lot easier.
Well, I think it helps from a professional development standpoint as well. I know the three of you are big on making sure our staff is up to date with the teachings and learnings about everything, especially with the policies. And I think that, we've got some situations here where, again, policy that's 4 years old, a lot could change relative to technology. Technology, usually you get that brand new TV, and then by the time you mount it on the wall, there's a new ad for the next great TV that's put up there. So, same type of thing with student rights and student records. They're changing constantly. So I think that that's a good thing. Oh, we lost your volume, John.
I'm okay with that too, as long as it doesn't cost too much, because I thought that Cinda, John and I, given our experiences in life, that we could start going through policies and do some sorting, but as long as it isn't, as long as it's cost effective, Mike, I'm fine with having somebody go through them in advance of us. Certainly it'll save us a lot of time.
Yeah, but we need the legal end on there
Yeah.
to make sure that we're
Well,
good.
Yeah, I would never suggest we delete or change something without getting a legal
Right.
chop on it.
Yeah, I think that that's the biggest thing. I do agree. The experiences the three of you have are fantastic. And I think that the component that we just need to make sure is, again, it's got to be tailor made to North Rose-Wolcott. You know, there's so many policies that, as you know, that have been implemented that we may need to get away from because they're not mandated. The ones that are mandated, we always want to make sure that they're up to date and we're compliant with them. The ones that are not necessarily relevant anymore, remove, and ones that become new, we want to add. And I think that that's a huge piece. And we did, you know, very intentionally, Sarah and I talked about how to break it out so that it's worthy and worthwhile. And I actually consulted with a local superintendent to ask him what his thoughts were as well. But I don't feel like we're in the same position. The other superintendent talked about how it went over a period of time. And I don't know that I have the same amount of time in which they had to go through it. You know, I think from our perspective, we're pressed for time. We have a sense of urgency, especially hearing that the group went through the audit and identified some. And now it's just, let's break them up and take manageable bites and keep moving forward.
Yeah, I agree.
So you will be the key person who will steer us in the right direction as far as the policies, the numbers, and the procedure that we use.
Between myself and Tina, yes.
Yeah.
You know, she will, you know, go through these as well to make sure the policy numbers correspond with our current offerings. And
Right.
sometimes that's also what happened from, you know, Erie. We'd have to just go through and put extra eyes on it, but great service. We're going to continue with it right now until we get our, you know, fine print taken care of. And, you know, we refine what we have. And then, you know, yes, I hope that I am the one that can kind of guide us through, because putting that procedure book together as well, you know, it has to go hand in hand, and we have to make sure that, you know, they make sense.
Well, Tina did a fabulous job before of keeping the group straight and pointed in the right direction.
She usually does.
She did.
Now, you will remember that we were going through these with Scott, and we had a meeting where we had like some ridiculous number that we were going through, and we stopped. I
Yeah.
still have my folder, and there's, I don't know, 8 or 10, maybe Tina, you remember that we had.
Yeah,
we had
there's
a
some
meeting?
that are still left. I was talking with Mike about that. We still have some from the audit that we didn't finish, and when we had some changes, and I'm gonna get all of those to him, and we're gonna look at them and decide how to go forward with them.
Fine by me.
That's my priority right there, Paul, is to start with that audit. And those will be our focal point for the remainder of this school year. And then, you know, my hope is between April and July, we can make a very conscientious push to get that 8 to 10 narrowed down. Whether we get them all completed or not, that's yet to be seen, but the goal would be to try and complete them all by July 1st, put them through the policy committee, and then any changes that we need to make in terms of over the next 3 months, we will have the time and the ability to add those in, so that when September starts, you know, the dual read from every policy that needs to be changed will have occurred, so that in September, when children come back, you know, we're up and running again. And then we're taking smaller numbers of policies to break down with the policy committee.
It's an admirable goal.
Yeah, very good.
Okay.
Mhm. Okay.
All right. I will keep you all posted on the other stuff with the variance for construction, but you guys have a great day. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule and getting this done.
So
Thank
Cindy,
you. Thank you.
you're
Have
gonna
a
make
good-
sure this is on the agenda, right? Cindy, you're gonna
Yeah.
make sure this is on the agenda for the next
Tina
meeting.
and I will, and we have some time.
It'll be there.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
All
Thank you
right.
all. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Have a
Bye.
good
Bye.
week, everyone.